What if I told you one man turned his absurd ideas into millions? Yeah, Timothy Dexter, history's biggest fool, stumbled his way to a fortune. Ready to dive in? Born into the hard life of the 1700s. Timothy Dexter was born on January 22, 1747, in Malden, Massachusetts, into a life that was anything but glamorous. His parents were Irish immigrants who didn't have much to begin with, so little Timothy grew up scrapping for survival. He had practically no schooling, and by the age of 8, he was already out of school and working as a farm laborer. At 16, Dexter got a job as a tanner's apprentice. And let's just say the life of a tanner was not exactly appealing. It was dirty, smelly, and pretty much the last job you'd take if you had any choice. But for Dexter, it was all about scraping by. However, by a twist of fate, he ended up moving to Newburyport, Massachusetts in 1769, where his life took a drastic turn. He met Elizabeth Frothingham, a wealthy widow, and soon married her. Suddenly, Dexter, the poor tanner, had some money to play with. Marrying wealth and building a business empire. Marrying a wealthy widow gave Dexter access to funds he'd never seen before. He used Elizabeth's money to buy a mansion in Newburyport. You'd think Dexter might enjoy this comfortable life and settle down, but not our guy. Instead, he set up a small shop right in the basement, selling things like moosehide pants, gloves, and even whale blubber. Elizabeth ran her own little shop, selling notions or small items like thread and buttons. They seemed like the oddest of business couples, but in his mind, Dexter was already becoming a businessman. Then, something happened that would change Dexter's life forever. It was the end of the American Revolutionary War, and there was a ton of worthless continental currency floating around. Now, most people saw this money as trash, but Dexter saw an opportunity. He bought up tons of this currency dirt cheap, figuring it was worth the gamble. And as if the universe just wanted to reward his wild optimism, the US government eventually decided to honor these notes, giving Dexter a nice pile of cash. He was officially in the money now. A social climber in an era with no social media. With some real money in his pocket, Dexter tried his best to climb the social ladder, which, back in those days, meant getting some sort of title or recognition. He wanted to be seen as a somebody in Newburyport, but the upper-class people there just didn't take him seriously. Frustrated, he started pestering the government with petitions, insisting he should be granted a public office position. Eventually, the town gave him the grand title of Informer of Deer. Sounds important, right? Well, here's the kicker. There were no deer in Newburyport. They gave him this fake title just to shut him up and maybe have a laugh. But Dexter didn't care. He wore that title like a badge of honor, thinking it made him official. Laughing all the way to the bank with strange investments. If Dexter had one true skill, it was his ignoring good advice, and it surprisingly worked in his favor. People quickly realized he was a bit too eager to make questionable business decisions, so some jokers started giving him tips meant to bankrupt him. They told him to ship bed warmers to the tropical West Indies. For context, bed warmers were metal pans used to keep people warm in freezing New England winters. The plan was to make him look like an idiot and bankrupt him. But Dexter shipped the bed warmers anyway. And as bizarre as it sounds, he made a killing. The locals in the West Indies ended up using the bed warmers as molasses ladles, something they actually needed. Dexter made a profit and probably thought he was a genius. Next, they told him to send wool mittens to the hot West Indies. But guess what? Asian merchants bought them up and shipped them off to freezing Siberia, where they were a huge high IT. Dexter was rolling in money, completely unfazed by what should have been terrible advice. And it didn't stop there. Someone even dared him to ship coal to Newcastle, a city in England famous for its coal. It should have been a recipe for disaster, except there was a miners' strike, and Dexter sold his coal at a premium. Every crazy idea he tried somehow ended up working out in his favor. The eccentric millionaire, Bibles, cats, and corset stays. Once Dexter had a taste for risky investments, he wasn't stopping. He shipped Bibles to the East Indies, where missionaries were grateful to get them. He also sent stray cats to the Caribbean to deal with a massive rat problem on the islands. And somehow, these investments worked out perfectly too. At one point, Dexter hoarded whale bones without even knowing what he'd use them for. Turns out, they became high in demand as stays in corsets, a must-have for fashionable women of the time. No matter how random his choices seemed, the universe seemed to bend in Dexter's favor, making him wealthier by the day. The man with 40 statues and a taste for the absurd. By now, Dexter was rich, and he wanted everyone to know it. He bought a massive mansion from a socialite named Nathaniel Tracy and decided to make it as outrageous as possible. He adorned it with minarets, placed a golden eagle on the top of the cupola, and surrounded it with 40 wooden statues of famous people, including George Washington, Napoleon, and, of course, one of himself. His statue was inscribed with the words, "I am the first in the East, the first in the West, and the greatest philosopher in the Western world." Humility was not exactly Dexter's strong suit. A fake death and a complicated family life. For all his wealth, Dexter's personal life was a bit of a disaster. He was constantly at odds with his wife, Elizabeth, and had an incredibly strange way of handling their relationship. In fact, Dexter often told people she was dead, even though she was very much alive and living in the same house. He went as far as to insist that the woman people saw around was her ghost. Imagine telling everyone your spouse is a ghost while they're very much alive, sharing the same roof. If that doesn't give you a sense of how eccentric he was, nothing else will. Dexter's eccentricity didn't stop there. One day, he decided to stage his own death, just to see how people would react. Imagine faking your own funeral just for fun. Word spread quickly, and about 3,000 people showed up to mourn him. But Dexter's grand plan hit a bit of a snag. He thought his wife wasn't grieving hard enough. This frustrated him so much that he couldn't keep up the charade. In an utterly bizarre move, he jumped out of his hiding place mid-funeral and scolded Elizabeth for not shedding enough tears over his death. This impromptu appearance shocked everyone and only solidified his reputation as a truly unpredictable character. Dexter was undoubtedly a man whose strange antics and boundless ego knew no limits. Writing a book without punctuation and still becoming famous for it. At 50, Timothy Dexter decided it was time to make his mark as a writer. Now remember, this was a man with hardly any formal education whose grasp on reading and writing was, let's say, unique. Yet Dexter, never one to shy away from a challenge, went ahead and published a book. The title alone was odd enough. A Pickle for the Knowing Ones. What was it about? Basically, it was Dexter's platform for venting. He ranted about everyone who got under his skin, politicians, religious figures, and even his own wife. Dexter's complaints were scattered across the pages, but here's where things get really interesting. This book was unlike anything anyone had seen. For starters, it had zero punctuation, not a single period, comma, or question mark in sight. Dexter's writing was a chaotic mix of capital letters and wild spelling that made it almost unreadable. Trying to understand his message was like cracking a code. It was as if he'd taken the English language and tossed it in a blender. Yet, somehow, Dexter's baffling book caught on. It was so strange that people couldn't help but be intrigued. A Pickle for the Knowing Ones became a hit, reprinted 8 times as readers spread the word about this eccentric piece of literature. And in his second edition, Dexter took things up a notch. He added an entire page of punctuation marks at the end, instructing readers to salt and pepper them in wherever they thought appropriate. For a man who could barely read or write, Dexter had stumbled upon a way to keep everyone talking. His book wasn't just a rant, it was a spectacle, a testament to his knack for capturing attention, even if by accident. A legacy of absurdity, and an estate that lives on. Dexter's estate was worth around $35,000 at the time of his death in 1806, a sum equivalent to nearly $800,000 today. After his passing, many of his belongings were auctioned off, and a major hurricane in 1815 knocked down most of the statues in his garden. But Dexter's quirky legend lived on. Today, fewer than 6 of his original statues remain, including a statue of William Pitt that was restored by the Smithsonian Institution. Dexter's mansion was turned into an inn after his widow Elizabeth died and passed through multiple owners until it was finally restored by a man named William Quill in the 1980s. Believe it or not, that mansion, known as the Timothy Dexter House, still stands today. There's even a street nearby called Dexter Lane in his honor, as if the town just couldn't shake off the memory of its most bizarre millionaire. From a poor tanner to a millionaire who somehow struck gold with one outlandish idea after another, Timothy Dexter's life is proof that sometimes fortune favors the bold, or maybe just the ridiculously lucky. And as weird as he was, his story is still told today because, let's face it, you don't come across characters like Timothy Dexter every day. So that's the wrap-up. If you enjoyed this wild story of Timothy Dexter's accidental fortune, hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to share and subscribe. Plenty more incredible tales are on the way. Let's keep this journey going together.